Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Elders Climate Action National Call. It's very exciting. This is our first call of 2020, and what a way to start the year, but with a call and presentation by Nathaniel Stinnett from the Environmental Voter Project. Before we get started and introduce Nathaniel, I would like to just point out to you a little bit of housekeeping. We have a chat box on the bottom of the screen, and we have a Q&A box also. There's a little box, if you hover to the bottom of your screen, there's a little box that has looks like a file folder with a Q on it. During the call, please put any of your questions in there, and we will answer them at the end of the call as soon as the presentation is over. If you want to communicate with somebody individually or everybody, you can do that in the chat. But please try and put your questions in the question box, and we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. If you go to the top of your screen on the right-hand side, you have two choices of speaker view or gallery view. Your best bet is to have speaker view on. That way it's going to show the presentation full screen, and you'll get the best advantage from this webinar. I'd like to introduce to you Paul Dreyfus, who is currently managing and coordinating our Elders Promote the Vote project. And he's going to talk a little about the project and then introduce Nathaniel Stinnett from the Environmental Voter Project. So Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Jerry, and please let me know if I'm not coming across loud and clear. I want to add to Jerry's welcome. We're very happy to have Nathaniel Stinnett from the Environmental Voter Project with us this evening as our presenter. And I just want to give a very brief bit of background about Elders Promote the Vote. It's a partnership between ECA and the Environmental Voter Project. We really started on kind of a semi-formal basis in the 2018 election cycle, where ECA volunteers completed more than 250,000 voter contacts. I know that seems like an amazing number, but I'm sure as Nathaniel goes through it, you'll see how it all works and how this is a great opportunity for we in ECA, which is a volunteer-based organization, to step up as volunteers and really work with Environmental Voter Project to have an impact on the upcoming election. And we'll come back at the end of the hour to talk about the specifics about how we can all engage with this work. At this point, I want to welcome Nathaniel and just give you a little bit of his bio. He's a nationally recognized expert on the application of behavioral science to promoting, to encouraging people to get out to vote. And he's had a lot of experience in leadership positions in political campaigns for Senate, congressional, state, mayoral races, and is generally a go-to guy when people want to get answers about how this all works, about how we can really take a new and kind of innovative approach to getting people out to vote. And at this point, I want to welcome Nathaniel, and here we go.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you, Jen and Jerry and everybody who is calling in tonight. But in particular, for those of you who don't know the amount of work that Paul puts in on a regular basis to make all of these volunteer opportunities for ECA members to contact non-voting environmentalists around the country, you should just know that he puts in hours each week to make this work extraordinarily smoothly. And Paul, I just want you to know how much everybody at the Environmental Voter Project really appreciates your work. And I also hope that everybody on the call knows how much we appreciate your work. You've had an enormous impact, and I hope to show you a little bit of the impact that you're having in the presentation today. So just as an overview of what I'm going to discuss, I'm going to try to wrap things up around 7:40 so that we can have a nice Q&A session. But until then, I'm going to try to touch on three things. One, just very quickly, what does the Environmental Voter Project do and why? Then the next two things I'm going to discuss are sort of the two prongs of our work, which is identifying people who care deeply about the environment, yet they don't vote, and then turning them into better voters. So those are the three things I'm going to discuss. A little bit about the Environmental Voter Project. Second is, how do we find these non-voting environmentalists? Third is, how do we get them to vote? And then at the end, I'm going to sort of weave in, what are some of the things that we're looking forward to in 2020? What does the landscape look like? How many non-voting environmentalists are there? And most importantly, how can all of us together get involved to try to solve this problem and try to get more of these people voting? So I hope it's going to be really interesting. I only ask your forgiveness ahead of time about one thing, and that is, because I don't know what you care most about and what you're most curious about and what you're going to have questions about, there are going to be some things that I breeze over pretty quickly. I'm not going to give you a huge, like, hour-long in-depth presentation on data analytics. I'm going to give you like a 5-minute presentation on that. And just please bear in mind that I am on purpose breezing over some things, because if you want to dive down and ask more about them during the Q&A, then that's great. We'll get into that. So let's get started. One of the biggest reasons that we can't enact progressive environmental policy in the United States is that voters don't prioritize environmental issues. Now, I'm going to start with a history lesson. We are now living in a time when there are more people who prioritize environmental issues than ever before, but even 2 years ago, that wasn't the case. So let's go back to 2016. Back in the 2016 presidential election, the Trump-Clinton election, only 2% of likely voters listed climate or the environment as their top priority, and another 2% listed it as their second highest priority. This is nothing. This is nothing. My guess is many of you on this call were deeply frustrated when we sat through all of the presidential debates in 2016 and climate change didn't come up once. Well, this is why. This is why. There are almost no voters who listed it as their number one or number two priority, and politicians are in the business of going where the votes are. And so if there aren't enough voters who care about these things, there's no way in hell politicians are going to lead on them. Well, as you probably don't need me to tell you, things in the climate movement, thankfully, have changed a lot since 2016. In the 2018 midterm elections, and this was a slightly different set of issues that were asked about, but exit polls, so people who actually voted in the 2018 midterm elections, showed a significant amount of growth. Now there, in the exit polling data, they didn't ask about climate change and the environment, they just asked about the environment. But 7% of people who voted in the 2018 midterms listed the environment as their number one priority over all others. Over all others. That's huge growth. It's a slightly apples to oranges comparison, because obviously people who vote in presidential elections are different from people who vote in midterm elections. But no matter how we look at it, that was significant growth from 2016 to 2018. But still, if only 7% of the people who are voting list this issue as their top priority, there's no way that can cut through those numbers that you see for healthcare and immigration and the economy and jobs. Politicians are not going to pay attention to something that only 7% of voters list as their top priority. They're just not. And this is a huge problem. And many of you are probably now thinking in your heads, oh yeah, but when you look at polls of likely voters in the New Hampshire primary or Iowa primary, isn't climate change much higher? And you're right, it is. When you just look at Democratic primary voters, it is a much higher priority. And that's why all the Democratic candidates who are running for president talk about climate change now. It's a very simple correlation. The more voters who deeply care about an issue, well, the more likely it is to have politicians lead on that issue. But the problem is that's only happening among people who are likely to vote in a Democratic primary. When you look at the national picture of how voters care about these issues, it's still not nearly high enough to force leaders to act on this stuff. Now I'm going to get into some numbers, but first let me just explain this problem in more depth here. Campaigns only target likely voters. And for those of you who have heard my spiel before, forgive me for the next 2 minutes because it might be repetitive to some of you, but this is so important to understand. Who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is public record. It's public record. And so if I'm running Jen's campaign for governor in Arizona, we don't care about the people who only vote in presidential campaigns because they're not going to show up for her election. We also don't care about the people who are registered to vote but never bother to vote in any elections. And we certainly don't care about the unregistered voters. This is all public record. Any politician can open up their laptop and within 10 seconds, they can literally see by name and street address who votes and who doesn't vote. And believe me, they only have the time and money, by and large, to talk to the people who are going to bother to show up on election day. So all that polling data I just showed you of how voters feel about particular issues, that's the only thing that matters. Because not only do campaigns target likely voters, but if those are the only people you're going to talk to during the campaign, those are obviously the only people you're going to bother polling. Let's think about this in another context. If I am running Ford Motor Company and my job is selling cars, well, am I going to bother to do market research with 3-year-olds who aren't even old enough to drive? No, of course not. Well, similarly, politicians only care about getting enough votes. So why on earth would they bother polling and caring about the issues that non-voters prioritize? Non-voters don't count. And it's public record who votes and who doesn't vote. And right now, this is bad news for the environmental community and the climate community. Because that polling data I showed you is not secret. Anybody who's got enough nickels to rub together can put a poll in the field and figure out what issues voters care about and what issues they don't care about. But the really important word in what I just said is voters. Voters drive policymaking and non-voters don't. And the reason the Environmental Voter Project does what we do is based on that one issue right there. All the Environmental Voter Project does is we find people who deeply care about climate change and the environment, yet aren't voting, and then we turn them into better voters. That's it. We don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policy. We don't even try to persuade people to care more about climate or the environment. These are all important things, but we choose to do something different. What we do is we find the people who don't need to be persuaded, because we live in a place and a time where changing people's opinions about climate change is so hard and so expensive. And so instead what we do is we are in the behavior changing business. We're not trying to get people to care more about climate change. We're trying to find the people who already care so much that it's their #1 priority, yet they aren't voting, and we try to turn them into better voters. We're in the behavior change business, not the mind changing or opinion changing business. And before I get into how we do that, let me just tell you why we are in that business at this nonprofit. I say business, we're a nonprofit, just like you guys are. It's because there are huge numbers of non-voting environmentalists. In the 2014 midterm elections, 44% of registered voters voted, but only 21% of people who list climate or the environment as a top priority voted. That's an enormous turnout differential. In the 2016 presidential election, it got a lot better. 69% of registered voters voted, but 50% of environmentalists who are registered turned out. Again, still a differential, but slightly better. 2018 was much, much better. 2018 had great progressive turnout across the board, had great turnout, period, across the board. In 2018, we had a higher turnout rate than in any midterm election since 1914, which was like 3 months after the war to end all wars broke out. And so people were pretty concerned with where the world was going. That was the last time we had this high a turnout rate in a midterm election. But, excuse me, that's my phone. There we go. All right, are we back there? Okay, sorry about that, my phone rang. 53% of environmentalists turned out to vote. So much, much better turnout rate compared to the overall electorate. But still, environmentalists aren't even as good as the average voter. And I suggest to you that this is an enormous problem. I mean, if you look at the NRA, and I'm not suggesting that people who care about guns are the opposite of people who care about the environment. That's not the case at all. But just as an example, if you care deeply about gun rights right now in the United States, you vote like it's your job. You're up near 70 or 80%. You always vote. You vote for dog catcher. You vote for library trustee. You are looking for elections to vote for. Whereas right now, if you care deeply about climate and the environment, we just barely over the last 5-6 years have almost gotten up to average. And that's a huge problem because in raw numbers, let me tell you how many non-voting environmentalists there are. We identified 10.1 million already registered, dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists who sat out the 2016 presidential election. 10.1 million. An election that was decided by 77,000 votes. We identified 12.2 million who did not vote in the 2018 midterms. And as I'm going to describe to you in the next section of this presentation, when I talk about how we identify these people, you'll realize that when I say we've identified them, I mean it in the most precise, almost creepy sense. Like we literally know them by name and street address. This is how sophisticated political campaigns have now gotten. They are able to individually identify people who care deeply about particular issues. And so we are not estimating that there are 12.2 million people out there who care deeply about climate or the environment and did not vote. We've literally identified them on voter files. That is an enormous opportunity. And before you get frustrated by this, I want to suggest to you that this is actually great news because it is enormously hard. I probably don't need to tell you guys this because you probably deal with it on a daily basis with your friends and peers and family members. It's enormously hard to change someone's mind about climate change. It's enormously hard to change their opinion and get them to prioritize this issue if they don't already. But it's a lot easier to find someone who already cares about what we care about and just tweak their behavior and get them to vote more often. So the fact that there are over 10 million non-voting, dyed-in-the-wool climate activists out there who aren't voting, that's a huge potential pool of political power. And if those people start showing up, it will make a world of difference, not just on the federal level, but on the state and local level. So that's why we do what we do at the Environmental Voter Project. And very quickly, over the next 20 minutes before we get to the Q&A, I'm going to describe how we do it and how we are working with the folks at Elders Climate Action and with a lot of the people probably already on this video conference to turn these non-voting environmentalists into better voters. because very little of it is me and my staff sitting here in our office pulling some secret controls to make it happen. A lot of it depends on volunteers doing really, really important work on a daily basis that ends up adding up to tens of thousands and even hundreds of thousands of new voters. So this is how we do it. It's essentially a three-step process. We identify these non-voting environmentalists using data analytics and predictive modeling. And I'm going to get into a little bit of detail, not a lot of detail, but a little bit of detail of how that works. But then the second thing is, once we identify these non-voting environmentalists, we don't need to change their minds about anything. We could talk to them about chocolate chip cookies if that was the best way to get them to vote. We then have this ability to use completely agnostic messaging and leverage the latest behavioral science to do whatever it takes to get their rear ends out the door on election day. And that's an advantage that most candidate campaigns don't have. If I'm trying to elect, well, let's use Jen again. If I'm trying to elect Jen governor of Arizona, my only job is not just changing people's behavior, I also need to change their minds. And so I can't use whatever message is best to get them to vote. I need to dilute that message with stuff telling them how great Jen is. We don't need to do that. We're not trying to change people's minds. We're not trying to persuade them to care about the issue. We've already found the people who care. And so we can just double down on the behavior change messaging that works. We can double down on what we know gets these people to vote. And I'm going to get into that messaging as well. And then the last thing is habit reinforcement. We firmly believe, and we don't just believe this, we know it from running almost 100 experiments last year and the year before, that you can't change people's voting behavior if you only talk to them every 2 years when there's a big, sexy election. It just doesn't work. I get why we as a society really don't get excited except every 2 years when there's a big, sexy election. I understand that. But if what you're trying to do is actually change someone's behavior and get them to vote more often, you can't talk to them every 2 years. Just like if you're trying to get someone to change their eating habits or their exercise habits, you can't just talk to them every 2 years. And so whenever there's an election, local, state, federal, primary, general, we're trying to reinforce these habits and talk to these people to get them to be better voters. And so we honestly view every single election as an opportunity to change people's voting behavior. All right, now, how do we do this? This is one of the things that I'm just going to touch on in a somewhat shallow way, because I could go into it in enormous depth, but that would take up all of our time. And I'd rather see if you have any interesting questions about it and drill down during the Q&A. So how do we identify these non-voting environmentalists? You're probably sick about hearing about big data, and I'm going to show you a slide that's going to make your eyes cross. Don't feel like you need to read all of it, but I just want to tell you very, very briefly how we do this. We poll tens of thousands of people per state. And I'll give you an example. Let's say we are in Florida, where Jerry is from. We will poll 20,000 people, and we will ask them, what is your number one most important political priority? Obviously, unfortunately, not all 20,000 are going to say climate change, but let's say 2,000 or 3,000 list some environmental issue: climate change, clean air, clean water, environmental justice. Some environmental issue is their number one priority. Well, then we work with data scientists to do something that is very similar to what insurance companies do. What we do is we look at those 3,000 people on our voter files and we say, okay, these 3,000 Floridians said that climate or some other environmental issue is their number one priority over all others. So let's see, what other information do we have about these people on voter files? Well, some of them who are of a certain age group, who live in a certain area or have a certain number of kids in their house, all sort of answered the same way. Ooh, and we found another cluster that looks like this, and another cluster of Latina grandparents who probably make between this much and this much who answered this way. We start noticing these clusters. And then these data scientists compare these people to a lot of other data we have about them. I feel very uncomfortable about this, and you probably do as well, that there's so much data out there now that people have access to, where you shop, what car you just bought, stuff like that. But as long as it's publicly available, as long as it's something that you don't need to steal or do anything dirty for, as long as it's publicly available, then we're going to use it to see if we can figure out where all these super environmentalists are. So what these data scientists also do is they say, ooh, look what else we found in common with these 3,000 people in Florida. A lot of them just bought an electric vehicle. Ooh, and a lot of them have kids in the public schools, and some of them are registered with this party, and some are registered with that party. And what it allows us to do is start assigning values to various data points. And this is just an example. Please don't take this as being the truth for any one state. But we can say things like, oh, look, people who are agriculture and forestry employees are 11 times as likely as the average person in Florida to list climate as their #1 priority. Ooh, and people who got rid of their landlines and only have a cell phone are 9 times as likely. And basketball fans are more likely than baseball, hockey, and football fans. And we find all these weird little things, and no single variable on its own really helps us identify who these environmentalists are. But when you start putting them all together, it's magic. I mean, you can say things like, wow, look, a Latina grandmother living within 5 miles of Tampa Bay who bought a Volvo between 10 and 12 years ago and shops at Abercrombie and Fitch and subscribes to National Geographic has a 91.2% likelihood of listing climate as her #1 priority. And you can get that granular. And I know it's a little freaky, but a good analogy is, my guess is many of you, like I, have probably bought life insurance before. This is very similar to buying life insurance. What do you do when you buy life insurance? You fill out a whole bunch of forms that gives the insurance company information about you. What's your medical history? How old are you? How much do you drink? How much do you smoke? How much do you exercise? Do you like to go cliff diving or jump out of planes? You know, like, what's your risk profile? And they work with data scientists to build a predictive model. They don't call it that. They call it an actuarial table, but it's not that different. What they're essentially doing is they're trying to profile you and figure out, with all this data that they've learned about you, not to be morbid, but how long are you going to live? And they're going to sell you a policy based on that prediction. And if they're wrong, even by a little bit, like, the entire global economy crashes. And so they need to be really precise. Well, we're doing the same thing, except we're not trying to build a profile of everybody in Florida to figure out how long they're going to live. We're trying to use this polling data, where we've asked thousands of people what their #1 priority is. We combine it with all these other data points we have about them, and we are able to assign a score to every single person in the voter file in Florida, telling us how likely they are, from 0 to 100, to not just care about climate or the environment, but list it as their absolute #1 priority. And this is an example of a distribution chart of every single voter in the state of Florida and their likelihood of not just caring about this issue, but listing it as their #1 priority. And the average score is like an 18. And so you can see there are well over 1 million registered voters who are 3 times as likely as the average person in Florida to list climate as their #1 priority. I've breezed over a whole lot of this information, but what I can tell you is this. These predictive models allow us to individually identify by name and street address on voter files who are the people who care most about climate, and then just cross-reference it with their public voting history. And so when I say we know who all the non-voting environmentalists are in the state of Florida, we aren't 100% certain. These are predictive models. They are probability models. But what I can tell you is every person that we contact and every person that our volunteers contact, they are contacting people who have at least a 70% likelihood of not just caring about climate change, but caring about it so much that it's their #1 priority over all others. Moreover, they have such an awful voting history that we know they're extraordinarily unlikely to show up in whatever election you're texting or calling or canvassing people for. And so that's how we find these super environmentalists. That's how we find these non-voting environmentalists. I'm going to push ahead because we've got 8 minutes until the Q&A starts. So once we found these people, how do we get them to vote? Well, we canvass, we call, we text, we send direct mail, digital ads. But here's the really interesting thing. Because we now have a very, very, very high degree of certainty that these people don't just care about climate, but like if you shake them awake at night, they're going to scream climate change. Well, we can afford to just send them whatever messaging we know from all of our experiments is most likely to get them out the door. And what's really interesting here is that what we have found and what a whole generation of behavioral scientists have found is that you can't treat people like rational animals and try to rationally convince them of the value of their vote or why it's important to go out and vote. It simply does not work. And again, I'm happy during the Q&A to go through a whole bunch of experiments and explain to you why we've found this and other behavioral psychologists and economists have found this to be the case. But I'll tell you what does work. What does work is treating people as social animals, not as rational animals. What does work is trying to take advantage of the fact that all of us are trying to be a certain type of person. And we want people to think of us as a certain type of person. Maybe you want your friends and neighbors to think of you as smart, or funny, or civically engaged, or kind. There are all of these societal norms that we buy into that are enormously strong. And if we're able to take advantage of those norms that you buy into, you can really change people's behavior. So I'll give you an example. Oftentimes our canvassers just go to a door of one of these people we've identified as a non-voting environmentalist, and they simply say, Jerry, you've got an election coming up on February 11th. Do you intend to vote? Oh, you do? Will you sign this pledge card promising that you're going to vote? That's all we do. It's a simple thing, just asking Jerry to promise that she's going to vote. But the reason that's really valuable and relies on very sophisticated behavioral science is because we've realized that one of the strongest societal norms we have, not just in this country, but worldwide, is that unless you're a sociopath, you want people to think that you're an honest promise keeper. And so if you get someone to promise that they're going to take an action, it's like a trap has closed on them. Because then what we're able to do is right before an election, follow up with Jerry and say, hey, Jerry, I just want to remind you on January 28th, you made a promise that you were going to vote. And the election's coming up on Tuesday, and we know it's important to you to be an honest person who keeps her promises. And we'll follow up with you after the election to find out how your experience was at the polls. We have changed a conversation that could have been trying to convince Jerry of the value of her one vote in an election where millions of people show up. Instead of doing that, we have now said, okay, are you an honest person, Jerry, or not? And that drives turnout through the roof. It increases turnout 2, 3, 4 percentage points over our control group. If you don't think 2, 3, 4% is a big deal in this business, talk to Hillary Clinton. These are big, big numbers. We also use sometimes just basic peer pressure. We'll reach out to voters and we'll say, hey, Jen, did you know last time there was an election, 83 people on your block of Main Street turned out to vote? Just very simple, politically agnostic techniques like that. But because we are more likely to want to do what our neighbors do than we are to try to rationally figure out why we should walk out the door and cast our one vote, these are enormously powerful messages. Again, I could go through a lot of examples and why they work, but I want to quickly get to a lot of the work that we're doing together and answer your questions. So forgive me for breezing over some of this. What does this turn into? Well, as Paul mentioned in his intro, Elders Climate Action did an enormous amount of work with the Environmental Voter Project, not just last year in 2019, but also in 2018. Through texting, calling, canvassing, digital ads, and direct mail, we ended up contacting in 6 states 2.16 million voters. Because we submit all of our work to randomized control trials, which are like the gold standard of behavioral science experiments, we are able to prove with real scientific rigor that we were solely responsible for increasing turnout 2.7 percentage points over our control group in those 6 states. And that was good enough for adding almost 59,000 brand new environmental voters to the electorate in those 6 states for the 2018 midterms. Those are huge numbers. And a lot of that simply came from volunteers going like this, sending texts on their phone, or talking to their neighbors, knocking on their doors, and not trying to push them to support a particular candidate, but simply saying, Jen, there's an election on Tuesday, do you intend to vote? A very easy ask that we then follow up with really rigorous behavioral science, turning that into new votes. In 2018, we were in these 6 states: Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Florida, Colorado, and Nevada. Last year in 2019, we expanded into an additional 6 states. So just in September, we expanded into those orange states. So we are now working in 12 states. And last year in 2019, I really meant it earlier when I said every election is an opportunity to turn non-voters into voters. So we were active in, believe it or not, 613 different local and statewide elections. And you'll see in some states, there were just huge numbers of elections. In North Carolina, there were 110 local elections that we were involved in. Now, voter files haven't been updated yet for most of these states, so we don't know what our results were in many of them. But my guess is they are actually going to be better than they were in 2018 because it's easier to increase turnout in local races like this. But as soon as we have hard data on how much we increased turnout last November, we're going to get it to you guys so you can see. Now, moving forward, so very quickly, I'm going to just push through this because we're almost at the end of the presentation. Who are these non-voting environmentalists we've identified? They are slightly more likely to live close to an urban core. So they're more likely to be urban or near suburban than living in the exurbs or rural areas. Yes, these super environmentalists are more likely to be young, but that is less and less the case every time we do research. We are seeing something that looks more like a sine wave, where 18 to 24-year-olds have a big bump and they're much more likely to fit our criteria, but then it goes down, then it goes down. And then when you get into the late 50s, all through the 60s, all through the 70s, they're more likely again, especially among women, especially among women. We're noticing when we're isolating these people who list climate and the environment as their #1 priority, that there's always a gender gap. Women are always more likely than men to list climate or the environment as their #1 priority. But when you look at young people, that gender gap is really small. It's only like 4 or 5 percentage points. But the older you get, the wider that gap gets. And when you reach people in their 70s and 80s, women are like 30% more likely than men to list climate or the environment as their top priority. It's amazing. And then the last thing is, when we look at this population of people who care so deeply about climate or the environment that it's their #1 priority, people of color are always overrepresented. Latinos, African Americans, and in particular Asian Americans are overrepresented in this group. 2019, these are the numbers of people we contacted. I'm just going to push through this. I want to stress the importance of contacting people, not just for presidential general elections, but for every election. Why? One, because every election is important. And it's important because climate policy is not just made on the federal level, it's made on the state and local level. But two, and we've got tons of research to back this up, the best way to make a new climate voter in November is to talk to them this winter and spring and summer for 2 reasons. One, it is a cheaper environment to get your message through. There's less static. But two, it comes back to what I mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation. Whether you vote or not is public record. It's public record. And so if we get Jen to vote for the first time this winter in her presidential primary, it only takes 2 or 3 months for the record of Jen having voted to show up on public voter files. And then everybody and their mother says, holy moly, Jen voted in that low turnout presidential primary. She's definitely going to vote in our presidential general election. And then all these well-funded campaigns start talking to Jen. Not only making sure that she's going to vote, but they poll her and ask her what issues she cares about. And she's now a first-class citizen who's driving policymaking. And so it's enormously important. That's right, Jen. Yes, it's enormously important that we don't keep our powder dry and not talk to these people until September or October. We need to talk to them now because it's almost like we're communicating to the rest of the marketplace through the voter file. Because if we get these people to vote, then it's like there's this big red beacon next to their name saying, hey, look at me, I'm a voter now. And that changes everything. So what can we do? Certainly, you should promise to vote. We have a voter pledge on our website that you can sign, and we'll make sure that you never miss an election again. But really, really importantly, I have Paul's contact information on here. I think in maybe the chat box or someplace else, there's going to be information where you can sign up to volunteer with Promote the Vote, which is the Elders Climate Action program, where people are volunteering to contact these voters with us. And I just want to be really clear, it's a really easy process. You get trained by webinar. You don't have to talk to a single person or text a single person until you're super, super confident that you know what you're doing. There are always people there holding your hand and training you. It's a very easy process. But most importantly, you can do it from the comfort of your own home if you're texting, or you can do it in your neighborhood if you're canvassing. And it makes an enormous impact, an enormous impact. And the final thing I'll say is this: we didn't get too much into the behavioral science of why we use the messages that we use, but believe me, your social capital is far more valuable than you might imagine it is. And one of the most important things you can do, especially in 2020, is make sure people understand that the act of voting is one of the highest forms of being an environmentalist. It's one of the highest forms of climate and environmental engagement. If you let them know that about you, you will change their behavior. And that change will happen much more than if you sit down and try to rationally convince them why they need to vote. Because people are taking social cues from their peers and their friends all the time. And the more loud and proud you can be about the fact that you are politically engaged because you're an environmentalist, the more you're going to change the people around you. I've gone 5 minutes over. I apologize. Hopefully we've got plenty of time for Q&A. I will just close with this. Politicians go where the votes are. I know that sounds deeply cynical, but it's just how democracy works. You simply, you don't get to be a politician unless you get enough votes. And so politicians go where the votes are. And one of the most important things we need to understand in the climate movement is that simply by voting, simply by getting these people who are already with us to start voting, politicians will follow, or they don't get to be politicians anymore. I'm not going to claim that we don't have serious headwinds. The entire fossil fuel industry is spending serious money on this. We have gerrymandering. There are a lot of things that distort the efficiency of our electoral marketplace. But at the end of the day, it still comes down to politicians need to go where the votes are, or else they don't get to be politicians anymore. So if we get more of these climate voters to actually show up on election day, magical things will happen. Because I tell you, if we all woke up tomorrow morning and the front page of the New York Times said likely voters in the 2020 general election list climate change as their #2 priority, the whole world would change overnight. You kidding? I mean, the most like conservative Neanderthals in the electorate would like be tripping over themselves to talk about climate change because politicians go where the votes are. They go where the votes are. So that's why this work is so, so deeply important. All right. I would love to answer your questions. Or I think Paul or Jerry, did you want to jump in now, or should we go right to questions, or how should we do it?
I will start some questions and answer some questions for you.
Great.
And then Paul will tie us up at the end. But I just want to thank you so much for this incredible presentation. And I can tell you from my perspective, the first time I heard your presentation, my mind was blown with this data. I sat there and I said to myself, I cannot believe that this could possibly be true, that environmentalists don't vote. The data is there, and it's just an incredible opportunity that we need to take up this mission. So I have some questions. This is from Teresa, and she was on a training call for Elders Promote the Vote last week, and she was wondering what factors drove the selection of the 12 states that are currently being targeted. She's from Michigan, and that's not included, and she feels as though should we be targeting all swing states. So thank you for your fantastic and important work, and the question on how the states were selected.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Teresa. And boy, are you right that Michigan is important. So I am not going to claim that it is unimportant, but it is a state where the Environmental Voter Project would have far less impact than we could in other states. And let me explain why. So the first thing I'll say is the Environmental Voter Project does not just focus on impacting federal policymaking. We also focus on impacting local and state policymaking. And so what that means is we don't decide where to work just based on one-off elections. Because if that were the case, we would never be able to do this habit reinforcement that I spoke about earlier, which is so crucial for actually turning non-voters into voters. If we only cared about one-off elections, we would chase different elections and we never be able to follow up with each other, with voters, and turn them election after election into really, really good voters and start really changing policymaking. So instead, the criteria that we use is, okay, which states have huge populations of non-voting environmentalists? Which states have disproportionately large populations of non-voting environmentalists? Because those are the states where we know if we do our job, and every time there's an election, 3, 4, 5, 6 times a year in some states, we talk to these non-voting environmentalists. Well, there, holy moly, after 2, 3 years, we can literally double the number of climate voters, and we can have a real impact on local, state, and federal elections. And so the reason we're in our 12 states, many of which are federal swing states, but not all of them are, is because each of those states, so Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, I'd say like 9 of those 12 are swing states. But we aren't in those states because they are swing states. We are in those states because they have these huge populations of non-voting environmentalists. Michigan does not. Wisconsin does not. I would never claim that Wisconsin is an unimportant state in the 2020 presidential election. It is enormously important, just like your state of Michigan is, Teresa. But what I can tell you is our research shows there is not a large population of non-voting environmentalists in Michigan, nor is there in Wisconsin. And so we just really can't have a big impact there. We want to focus on states where we know if we do our job, we can have a really, really dramatic impact. Oh, Jerry, you're on mute. Yep.
Thank you so much for that answer. I have another question. This is from Tim. And he wants to know if there's a case study or model for planning home canvassing campaigns based on the access to target non-voters' addresses. And then can it be shared, and how do you access the GIS maps.
Got it. So could you just ask the first part of that question again? Yep.
Sure. Is there a case study or model for planning home canvassing campaigns based on the access to target the non-voter addresses?
Yep. Great question. Great question. So in our 12 states, we know who all of the non-voting environmentalists are by name and street address, because we've identified them on voter files. We also are able to, out of that universe, identify the ones that are what political campaigns call canvassable. Because if you live in a gated community, you can't be canvassed. If you live in a 20-story high-rise with a doorman, you can't be canvassed. And so yes, we can absolutely figure out who those people are. And then finally, we have the software to generate maps for people. And so we will not just train you by webinar, but we will send people the canvassing literature and maps, and you can even do it over our software on your phone if you'd like, if you don't want to use paper. And you can go and knock on these doors, and we'll train you with how to talk to these people. And yes, it is a very, very simple process. The only thing is, if you want to canvass, you either need to live in one of our 12 states or be willing to travel to one of our 12 states. And so that is important. But wherever you are in those 12 states, yes, we can generate a map for you, let you know who you need to talk to, where they live, train you on how to do it. But what's great about texting is you can be in all 50 states and text into these 12 states. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. And just as clarification, the canvassing is also only completed in the states that you currently are, in the 12 identified states, correct?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Great. We have another question. Does contacting someone in another state from mine have less impact than somebody from the same state or neighborhood via text?
Outstanding question. No. No, there have been an enormous number of studies, some of which we have done, many of which other organizations have done. If you are texting somebody, it has exactly the same impact if you're texting from Timbuktu than it does if you're texting from around the corner. It is different if you're doing door-to-door canvassing. That is different. But if you're texting, there is no difference in increase in turnout, whether you're from the state or not from the state. None whatsoever. But that's a great question, because that's not the case if you're doing door-to-door canvassing. There, neighbors do have a higher impact than if you're, parachuting in from out of state a week before the election. Yeah.
Thank you. Another person who's asking, how many contacts do you take if you're going to do this? And I think referring to list generation.
Right. Great question. So it depends on the communication channel you're interested in using. If you are interested in canvassing, so door-to-door canvassing, well, the shortest honest answer is whatever you're comfortable doing. If you want to knock on 10 doors, you'll knock on 10 doors. Usually, and it depends on how spaced out the doors are, people will knock on anywhere from 30 to 50 doors. There are some people who just want to knock on 80 doors. There are some people who only want to knock on 10 doors and call it a day. That's totally fine with us. As far as texting, the way this software, the way this application, whether you're doing it on your computer or on a phone, the way it works is once you're trained, you can do as much or as little as you want. You literally could log on, send one text, and then walk away. Or you could send 1,000. We have some people who will sit there and watch a basketball game and just go like this and send 20,000 texts. So you can do as much or as little as you want. Our hope is that for door-to-door canvassing, you won't just knock on one door. We hope you'll end up liking it, but you can do it at your own pace. You really, really can.
Thank you. We just have time for one more question, and then we really need to wrap up. Somebody is saying that, you know, what if I've never done texting and I feel uncomfortable doing it and I pay for my own texting? So how do we address that?
Very, very good question. So first of all, the paying for texting, this is, you will be using your phone or using your laptop, but you will not be using your account. Instead, what you'll be doing is, many of you probably have smartphones where you have apps on there, you know, maybe a social media app or an app where you can check the weather. Well, what you will do if you're texting for the Environmental Voter Project is you will use an app, and it's an app that anonymizes who you are. And so not only are you not charged because it's not coming from your cell phone number, we are charged, the Environmental Voter Project is. So if you send 1,000 texts or 10,000 texts, it's we who get charged, not you. But it also isn't coming from your cell phone number. If someone texts back, they're texting into the app, they're texting into the software. And so they don't know what your phone number is. They can't bother you if you've done this. And so it's not something that you need to worry about from a personal identifying information sort of point of view. You can log on, if you're very nervous about this, you can send 10 texts and you'll say, hey, I'm a volunteer from the Environmental Voter Project, but they're not going to have your cell phone number. And if they reply to your texts, it might not even be you who responds to their reply. It might be another volunteer who sends the response. And so this is completely anonymized. That being said, even though it's completely anonymized, and even though you're not being charged to send texts, we are, you don't have to do this until you are 100% comfortable with it. You can attend 7 online training webinars if that's what it takes to get you to a comfort level where you feel like you want to do this.
Great, thank you. We're going to have to close. I just want to let you know before everybody leaves about our next call next month, and then Paul has some announcements. Paul Dreyfus has some announcements about our Elders Promote the Vote project. Our next call is on February 24th, and we will have as a guest speaker Peter Toscano, who is talking about something funny about climate change. He's both a comedian and a storyteller, so please join us. And I'm going to turn it back over to you, Paul, to just close out, please. Thank you.
Yes, I want to thank everyone for being here, and thank Nathaniel for an incredible presentation. And we in ECA are very fortunate to be partnering with you because you bring so much insight and expertise. But this is not just an intellectual exercise. I think, as Nathaniel made very clear, this is all about volunteers getting out there, doing the canvassing, doing the texting, and we have the potential to achieve some very high numbers of contacts and voters turned out. The one other thing I want to point out is that we've developed a kind of a system for supporting volunteers that involves Environmental Voter Project staff, our volunteer leaders of Elders Promote the Vote. So if you make the decision that you want to be part of this, our commitment to you is we will support you. We'll provide you with the training and technical support and encouragement, whatever you need. And the one other thing I just wanted to mention is that we are forming state teams in a number of states. So when you register, we will be sure to connect you with your state team leader so that you can also get kind of a local level of support too. And also we see kind of the state teams and local teams as being the best approach to canvassing, although it's certainly fine if you want to go out and canvass individually. We're really hoping that the state teams, already New Mexico has gotten a head start on this and had some success with it. So just encourage you to sign up and bear with us. Sometimes things don't go totally smoothly, but we'll get there, and we have the potential to literally, the Promote the Vote team has the potential to achieve several million contacts and turn out tens of thousands of voters. So thank you so much for your interest and hopefully for your participation.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you so much, Nathaniel. This has been awesome. And we do have a few questions that we weren't able to get to, so hopefully we will email them out to both Paul and Nathaniel and get you all some answers on those questions. But I'd like to thank everybody. This is definitely an incredible opportunity for Elders Climate Action, and a way that you can actually do something and feel like you're making a difference. So it can be very rewarding just personally to actually, make an effort that's directed at individuals, knowing that there's some data to back up and science to back up the fact that you could be making that individual actually go out and vote. So thank you all and good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.